We're already underway? Okay, good. Just to start, I wanted to ask if you guys have any questions about the exam once again. For a moment, I'm going to go to the the portion of the exam that is actually the instructions, because I did add a couple of things in the instructions that I thought perhaps you guys might take note of. Do you guys have access to it? I added a few things. Obviously the business about, you should proceed through the exam only with the knowledge you have in the prior questions and the question that you're answering, and not questions that come later in the exam. But the other thing that I wanted to point out to you, also pay attention to the facts, make sure that you fully understand what the facts are, which means read them closely. But lastly, I wanted to point out something I pointed out in class before, but I thought it was worth noting again. And that is that you should really focus on what the question is asking you. So for instance, I think I mentioned that the fifth question of the midterm, a lot of people, well, actually everybody who wrote the answer sort of missed what the thrust of the question was. In the law, we talk all the time about credibility. In politics, we talk about ad hominem attacks and suggest that, we shouldn't question the speaker's credibility, and we should merely listen to their arguments. But truthfully, since in most instances we're dealing with subjects that we know less about than the speakers do, their credibility will always matter. So when somebody engages in a debate and they represent that some things are true, we hear about fact-checking all the time. But also, we assess why would they say this as opposed to that. So in the case of the fifth question from the midterm, the issue was that in the final, she's now the executive, or he, as the case may be, he or she is now the executive director. We didn't specify gender for obvious reasons. And the question now is, in the fifth question was, his or her credibility had been attacked. The person attacking his or her credibility was saying, you don't have a right to speak because you have a material investment in this issue, that is, that you have a child who is dying. And therefore, anything you say is going to be shaped by your hope that that Angela has the capacity to heal. So obviously, clearly, that was true, that the person who's now the executive director, then senior staff, really did have an investment in the outcome. But what I also hope you note in the course of this exam is that so does everybody else, although for different reasons. So the technology sector has a huge investment in what is happening with Angela, the government does, everybody has an investment. It's just as in all politics, those investments are defined differently. So take note of that. Obviously, now that the executive director's child is dead, his or her credibility can no longer be attacked on that basis, but his or her credibility could be attacked on other bases. For instance, the executive director, we assume, is a Christian and hence has an investment from that perspective, whereas obviously there are persons of other faiths who are also impacted by what happens in the Angela scenario. Obviously, there are infinitely, well, not infinitely, but certainly there are vast numbers of religions on the planet Earth. And so if indeed Angela is representative of a single religion, then necessarily other persons of other faiths are going to look askance at that. Of course, and I must point out, one of the central points throughout this is everybody is projecting their beliefs on Angela as to who or what they think she is. And the truth of the matter is that since Angela has been enslaved for the duration of her life, they've actually never had the opportunity to ask her what she thinks, which of course is also central to this hypothetical that nobody cares to inquire of Angela what she thinks or wants or desires. So anyway, so here we are at the last installment of this exam, and it's very interesting because I selected a video by the same person that you watched briefly when our speaker came to talk about environmental rights. He is, of course, himself a clergyman, but he also was formerly the executive director of Amnesty America, or Amnesty USA. And as you also saw, brilliant speaker. I mean, he's, you know, you can't help but watch him. But anyway, so I just think it's interesting because obviously that individual could well be the executive director we now have before us, somebody who does have an investment from a religious perspective, if not necessarily. I don't know that he has loved ones that are currently dying, but obviously there are always people who have loved ones who are currently dying or who themselves are facing death. And that indeed would impact on your perspective. So what about, but the question that he raises in his tape that you, or video that I had you guys examine, was what is the future of human rights? And I chose that because obviously his perspective on it is quite uplifting, whereas if you examine, you know, sort of the empirical evidence, it seems very much as if human rights have made very little gain in most of the world, and in fact the human rights records of most states are abysmal. If we took the Angela hypothesis is true, plainly the United States is doing poorly, but we don't have to look at the Angela hypothesis. Do you recall the gentleman who we had hoped to come speak? He was from the Ramapo Nation, and it turns out, although I still not had any contact with him, that there was a report on the local news that the Ramapo Nation is currently having a fight with one of the towns that their territory, traditional territory, encompasses. They had set up traditional teepees. They were observing some kind of religious rite, spelled R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T. And because they were basically sitting on what was deemed to be public lands, they were being driven off yet again. How surprising. They were being compelled, supposedly for public safety reasons, public health reasons, to take down their tents because they didn't have adequate bathrooms, sewage, what have you, etc., etc. So my supposition is that he probably was unavailable to us because this fight was yet again going on. So anyway, so that was what was happening. So these questions obviously never stop. I have spoken extensively about the situation with persons who have limited intellectual capacities, who are suffering from mental health issues, who have other disabilities, and the way that the United States treats them as burdens and tries to sort of offload them by one means or another. I don't know if I related this to you, but I may have done. But years ago, the first time I worked in this area, I was working with a woman. I have never personally been under an obligation to take any of these folks to see doctors of any sort. But basically, what she discovered is that when she brought these folks to see doctors, they were basically compelled to sign do not resuscitate orders. First of all, there's very little probability that they understood what they were being compelled to sign. And second of all, it's really a reflection on our medical system once again that they were being asked to sign them in the first place, because the basic working assumption by these doctors is their lives are not worth living, and hence, you know, there's little point in resuscitating them in the event that their heart should stop or what have you. So it's really extraordinary, our perspective on burdensome people, as it were, and that we should be rid of them. And obviously I would suggest this is an ancient perspective, not a new one. The Inuits used to put defective babies, or babies they perceived as being defective, on ice floes and left them there to die, because they would be a burden to the tribe. We could, the Chinese, as a historical matter, when they had limited resources and a female baby was born, they basically abandoned the child because it would once again be a burden on their resources, and so forth and so on. So this is not new behavior. This is ancient behavior. It probably goes back to the beginning of time, at least time, as measured by the existence of the human species. And obviously we can find the same or similar behaviors among other species, where a infant is rejected because for some reason it does not have the capacity, it is somehow incapacitated. There are also instances of obvious altruism, even cross-species altruism, where there are attempts made to save, infants who are in the jaws of a predator, or who are stuck in mud, or who are... there was one interesting case where a polar bear, actually in a zoo, saw in the water a bird, I believe it was a crow, that had gotten stuck in the water and for whatever reason was unable to get back out. And it picked it up with its mouth and put it out on dry land. And of course, eventually the bird dried off and flew away. So why would he do that? Well, because there is, some evolutionary purpose to altruism. Mostly it's observed within a species as between species members, and mostly it's observed within a family, where a family member will sacrifice his or herself on behalf of another member of the family that is genetically closely related. But clearly it is not exclusively the case. You hear all the time about, God, it was a few years back, a black man, I thought interesting, who jumped in front of a train to save a white child. So not only cross-species, cross-race, cross-ethnic group, for whatever reason, and when he was interviewed, he said, well, they asked him, well, why did you do that? Didn't you pause to think that you were endangering yourself? And he said, I didn't stop to think, I just had to go save the child. So there's something very deep, also in our genetic makeup, that enables us to experience these feelings of altruism. So how these two things coexist, I cannot say. Why it is that some people feel motivated to act in an altruistic way, even at the expense of their own lives, whereas others just simply want to unload people they perceive as burdens. It's difficult to say what is the difference in our moral character and why we behave as we do. In any event, obviously human rights is all about altruism ultimately. It's about reaching out and trying to save people who are suffering. Hopefully not because of us, the people who are trying to save the individuals who are suffering, but in any event, that for whatever reason we feel that we should help. And so the question is, do we think that human rights have a future? So before I start this discussion, you guys have any comments? Anybody want to speak to that at all? RX, what do you think?
I don't have something new, because I think I agree with what you just said. That like human rights advocates should care about the people who are suffering around the world.
Okay.
Because I think that's how human rights law work. Like, it does not concern with only citizens within a certain territory borders, but the enjoyment of human rights of the whole humankind.
So what do you think motivates us to sort of think about human rights in a transnational way. Why should we care? I mean, Donald Trump's whole gig is that, America first, damn the rest. Why should we even care? I mean, there are plenty of people who would argue that charity begins in the home, right?
Yeah, because I think there is a bottom line of our because I think there is a bottom line of behavior, and we should not stand there that there is serious human rights violation, even if it is not a matter of national interest. So I think, like, if we know that there is ongoing, like, heinous crime in another place of the world, to speak selfishly, it will someday affect the rights of our rights, like, although it is not happen in our environment.
You don't think so? Anybody else want to speak to, if we ignore the human rights of others, ultimately we will lose our own human rights? That was actually the position of Martin Luther King. Laura, you want to speak to that? I know Doris is here, but unfortunately she's in the library, so she can only type. So Laura, what do you think?
I think there's certainly a philosophical argument to be made about that, but I think it's kind of grandstanding to suggest. I mean, I guess if you're saying that to restrict somebody else's human rights will eventually restrict your own because of the standard not being upheld universally, then yes. But as far as the question of the future of human rights, sorry, I can hear myself on the echo on Grant's computer, and it's very distracting to me. Anyway, what was I saying?
So you think it's grandstanding, really, to say that if I don't protect your human rights, eventually mine will not be protected? Or is that just reciprocity?
Makes sense, because it's kind of creating a norm where if you ignore somebody else's human rights, why should they help you if yours are being violated? So I would agree with that.
So if I don't bother to care about you today, then you might not bother to care about me tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
Or as they say, what you send around comes around, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Grant, what do you think?
Oh, Grant was just in the bathroom, so.
Oh, he left?
He just left.
Well, he's not permitted to go visit the bathroom. We don't allow those things. Class has started. I didn't see him raise his hand. Anyway, Andrew, what about you? What do you think? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here, and I do agree with what Brian and Laura were just saying. I think one of the main impetuses for why people invest in human rights is they see themselves, even if it's selfishly, they see themselves in the harm of others, and that's sort of like the universal impulse, the universalistic impulse that animates the human rights agenda, in my opinion. I mean, for instance, like if you're somebody who is part of a sexual minority, or who is gay or lesbian, and sees people being locked up and incarcerated or even brutalized because of their orientation, you sort of ask yourself, why do I get to enjoy a higher degree of human rights in that regard than people living in another country? So, you know what I'm trying to say? It's just an extension of like seeing that we're all human, and that we should, regardless of which state we live in, we should be guaranteed a certain level of dignity and protection.
Okay. So you think that is that the empathy is where the drive for human rights comes from?
Definitely.
In point of fact, empathy is also, according to many, the very foundation of all morality. That when we see someone who is being harmed, we feel empathy for that individual, regardless of whether our relationship is as direct as they're gay, I'm gay, I'm upset that they're being treated badly, but merely because we're human beings and we see someone being tortured or beaten or raped or what have you. The thing that I think drives our desire to respond is indeed empathy, which, as I said, has been argued to be the foundation of all human rights. Anyway, so let's turn to Jack Donnelly, who talks about human rights in foreign policy and what the appropriate role is for human rights in foreign policy. In some ways, I think he's basically a realist. And so in some ways I kind of found his how he views this as being a little bit, I don't know, depressing. Because obviously he does not necessarily think human rights is at the top of any state's agenda, and even goes so far as to argue that perhaps it ought not to be. So he says that there are three basic arguments against folding human rights into foreign policy. The first one is the realist who argues that foreign policy ought to be about national interests defined in terms of power. The second one is the statist who maintains that an act of concern for human rights practices of other states is inconsistent with the fundamental principle of state sovereignty. And lastly, there is the relativist position that international human rights are mere moral imperialism, and that we should not impose our particular brand of morality on others. So let's look at realism to begin with. The argument is that we are faced with a world of enemies, and therefore our concern for power must override everything else. To act with compassion would be to invite attack, and we've all experienced that on the playground, right? If we're nice to somebody, if we're nice to the bully responds by saying, oh, opportunity here, to bully someone who, to all appearances, is weak. So to act with compassion would be to invite attack, but if power is a necessary pursuit of foreign policy, he argues, it need not be the exclusive pursuit. Realism, if taken as true, reveals the danger of overemphasizing human rights, but it does not require the exclusion of human rights as a matter of principle. All interests are not reducible to power. Interests are a function of what states value, and in certain contingencies, he acknowledges it may be unwise to pursue human rights. That should be a decision that is taken on a case-by-case basis. So what about statism? The statist argues that what a state does with its citizens is an archetypical matter of sovereign jurisdiction and of absolutely no concern to others. The statist stresses that the principle of sovereignty and more broadly international law are appropriate limits on the pursuit of power. Sovereignty, however, is the starting point of international law and not its end point. At least this is Donnelly's perspective. Over the past half-century, an extensive body of human rights law has been developed. There are, moreover, numerous instrumentalities of foreign policy, for instance, the granting of or withdrawing of preferential trade rights or trade agreements that do not involve intervention in the sovereign affairs of states, and yet, of course, have an impact domestically such that the domestic government may act in accordance with human rights in order to avoid the consequences of not doing so. How about relativism? And we talk about this a great deal, particularly in connection with minority rights. In addition to a strong emphasis on non-intervention, the relativist emphasizes the principle of self-determination or commitment to international pluralism. Realists argue that there is no internationally accepted relativists, not realists. I should correct my own notes here. Relativists argue that there are no internationally accepted standards of morality to which a state could appeal. However, virtually all states regularly and explicitly proclaim their commitment to the Universal Declaration and, of course, the two covenants. Therefore, with the exception, of course, of the United States, who makes reference only to one. Therefore, to act on behalf of internationally recognized human rights is not to impose one's own values on others. The relativist argument reminds us that universal standards need to be tailored to their implementation, to reflect particular cultural and historical circumstances. It does not show that pursuing human rights in foreign policy is in fact inappropriate per se. What about human rights in the American identity? I think we all know that the United States, particularly post-World War II, probably before that, but certainly after that, there is this perception that Americans have that we're the good guys. The whole Superman thing, where, what is the expression? Superman fights for truth, justice, and the American way, right? So that obviously reflects something that's sort of deep in our cultural character, that we think that that's what defines us, truth, justice, and the American way. Hence, Superman, of course, has long been extremely popular. So, so this is a perception of ourselves. This is who we are. We go in there, we save the day, we fix things, we make things right, and then we go home. Do you think that continues to be our self-perception, or do you think that that has sort of become, have we destroyed that with time since World War II? Anyone care to speak to that?
I think it's definitely gone down from where it was before, like with our grandparents' generation, for example. America's the greatest thing to ever happen in the history of Earth. Whereas, like, now, it's more like, yeah, we can do good and we can also do bad. And, like, a more tempered understanding of America's place.
So we're perhaps a little bit more realistic about who we really are, you think?
I think so, especially after the Iraq invasion. I think that had a big toll on America's perception.
How old were you when Iraq happened, just out of curiosity?
Iraq? Well, a bunch of manufactured intelligence from the Pentagon.
No. I'm asking you, how old were you when Iraq happened?
Iraq first happened when I was 9.
Do you have a recollection of it at the time that it was happening?
Yes, because a lot of my family went to Iraq.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So you really, really had a direct understanding of what that was all about.
Yes, 2 cousins, an uncle, and brother-in-law.
Did you lose anybody?
No, but they all came back with absolute... One of them lost a leg, and they came back with just... None of them came back really happy with what they were doing.
Okay.
And so it took a big... That, for me, even when I was little... When you don't really understand things, even then that took a toll that they all came back talking about how terrible it was.
Okay, so bad thing. But if you happen to have been, if you talked to your grandparents, then they probably would have told you about the same thing with Vietnam, right?
Yeah, my grandpa was a naval pilot in Vietnam, and he was not, yeah. He didn't like to talk about it, though. And I think that was the difference between him and them, was he didn't want to talk about it. He wanted to pretend he wasn't there, wasn't a part of it, nothing went down.
Well, obviously, our response to Iraqi soldiers is a reflection of how badly we treated soldiers that fought during the Vietnam War, right?
Yeah.
As a matter of historical record, the fact was that when soldiers came home from the Vietnam War, we all but spat on them in the street. They actually did actively try to hide their memory. There was a reluctance to discuss their experiences with other people because, first of all, a relatively small portion of the population went to Vietnam, but secondly, and therefore couldn't fully understand what it's like to go to war, but secondly, because it was so highly controversial. So what has this all done to who we think we are? Hate to keep picking on the same people. I won't ask our ex because, her perception is as a foreigner in a foreign land. So I'm going to pick on on Andrew here again. What do you think? What is our perception now as Americans of who we are?
Okay, I actually do have some thoughts on this based on some research I've been doing for my thesis and such. I'm sort of interested in how the United States and the United Kingdom as the world's 2 leading liberal powers have conceived of their roles in the world over the past 2 centuries, and how that's sort of been challenged by notions like Brexit and the Trump presidency and the Iraq War and all of that. And this one book that I've been reading was suggesting that the Anglo-American philosophy of liberal internationalism was sort of seen as a tool of creating a type of modernity that all of humanity should aspire to. And that's why the United States and the UK and other English-speaking countries are so keen to intervene in other countries' affairs to sort of foster this democratically liberal worldview. And I think that's part of what you were talking about earlier, like we see ourselves as the good guys of history, or the ones who have figured out the path to modernity. And it's, we have to sort of create world institutions that reflect those values and sort of lead the world along that way. But I think, like Grant was saying, like events in like Vietnam and Iraq have sort of called into question the moral efficacy of those types of thoughts, and whether one way of thinking about values and human rights is best, or we need to have a more culturally relativist approach or pluralism, if any of that makes any sense. But I think
so. We have
now,
tempered.
actually,
You're saying we have tempered our views about how we should impose world order on the world because we do have these sensitivities about cultural differences, right?
Right, and then this one book that was basically just saying for a very long time, Americans and British, and they felt that their values were the correct ones. Their language was the one that needed to, their language on morality and humanity and rights and liberty and all that stuff was what needed to be propagated globally. And now that's not necessarily the case anymore. It's kind of,
So part of our moral development is that we're a bit embarrassed by our colonial past.
Right, definitely.
Okay, Laura. So he included all English-speaking states, and you're our representative from Canada. So speak up.
Okay. Am I speaking up about Canada specifically, or about the United States?
Well, actually, speak in terms of Canada, because I think that our political culture is actually somewhat different as a product of the fact that the United States is this big, huge superpower to the south, and Canada is a medium power that hopes to have influence on the world, but does not have the same resources to have an impact that the United States does. So speak to that.
Yeah. So Canadian identity is something that's very interesting to me as somebody who has grown up in Canada, obviously, but also been schooled a lot in the States, so I can kind of watch both cultures interact. And Canadians are very interesting in that individually, a lot of the Canadian identity is based on the fact that we're not American, and people are very proud of the fact that they're not Americans. But at the same time...
Well, that's embarrassing. For us, I mean.
But at the same time, American culture and values and policy is incredibly important to Canadian culture and values and policy. And as like one of the United States' greatest allies, aside from Great Britain, Canada has always kind of, well, not always, not in all circumstances, but tended to lean with the United States in foreign policy decisions more often than not.
Did it have a choice? I mean, hasn't that been one of the concerns that Canada's had, is that they felt that they were being compelled to sign up with the United States? Actually, the UK recently has expressed similar frustration that, that you're sort of puppets of the United States.
Do you mind if I interject on that issue really quickly?
Please do, yeah.
Laura, because the book that I mentioned earlier actually addressed divergences between the United States, the UK, and Canada in particular. And the one episode that they looked at in particular was the Iraq War. And they noted that it was interesting that Canada did not choose to militarily intervene along with the United States in Iraq, but Great Britain did. And it was very important for Tony Blair's government and his view of liberal internationalism that Britain was a part of that effort alongside the United States. And these authors made the argument it's because that British identity, to a larger extent than Canadian identity, is predicated on being globally influential and along the same lines as American identity is. So maybe we need to restrict that type of identity to just Britain and the United States, and maybe...
Hey, pause there, Andrew, because I'm not sure that our Canadian would agree. I mean, Canada has been very active in the human rights movement, has it not?
Right, perhaps in the human rights movement, but it was making the argument that the US and the UK are more prone to use force when necessary to enforce their type of worldview than maybe somebody like Canada or even also Australia would be.
I don't think Canadian policymakers have ever pretended to think that they're going to be like a superpower. So I think that has given Canada more freedom to pursue policies in a humanitarian, human rights, more focused agenda.
Whereas the US is the contemporary superpower and Britain was, the global hegemon before the United States came to occupy that position. So that's been relevant.
So you think that that has shaped us in a way that's different from New Zealand or Australia or Canada or South Africa?
I think it also is related to the relationship with multilateral institutions, because Canada's reason for not intervening in Iraq was because it didn't have UN backing, and Canada said that if the intervention had UN backing, it would join the coalition in Iraq. So I think that that goes down to the relationship between these two countries and the UN as well, because the United States is more likely to try to act unilaterally because it has that power already, and Canada is more likely to try to uphold international institutions because it is a middle power.
And so it uses its moral suasion to try to persuade, I presume, the United States to not engage in the use of force, right? Where possible.
At least not unilaterally. Yeah.
Okay. But rather to do so under the auspices of the UN. RX, now I'm going to ask you to come back. What is your perception of sort of the American character? I mean, I'm sure that there are plenty still Americans who imagine themselves to be the good guys. That is sort of part of our perception of who we are. But what if sitting in China? What is the perspective from China? Are we those people that we think we are?
From the perspective of China, I think we are very cautious of Americans' accusation of Chinese human rights violation, because we know we know there are the off the record violation in China, but we think that all the accusation that comes from Americans is have a hidden motive of political reason. And
so that's the credibility question with regard to the Angela hypothesis, right? Why is America pursuing this particular issue?
Yeah, it's we can find every movement commenced by America with a hidden reason, not very justified reason. And also, I think from my own perspective, I think the advocate of human rights from the perspective of America is sometimes helpful, but I'm not really in the position that agreeing with the use of force, because I think the mere advocate of human rights is one matter, but the use of force in another country is another matter. It's if you participate in this war in another country's territory, it constitutes this intervention of the sovereign of that country.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what about Vietnam and Cambodia? Was that a good thing or a bad thing?
I'm sorry?
What about Vietnam and Cambodia? We are going to come back to this subject. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? Should Vietnam have intervened in Cambodia at the time that the Khmer Rouge was slaughtering millions of its own?
I think intervention is not absolutely forbidden, but what matters is the way how you intervene.
Okay. So you would agree that there are times when the use of force is really the only option to stop a humanitarian tragedy of the scale that happened in Cambodia or Kampuchea?
I think the use of force should be the last option, and it definitely should be under the authorization of the UN or other organization among governments, among states.
Okay. So anybody disagree with that? Is there a time when the only option really seems to be the use of force? Anyone care to speak to that? I was sorry, I just moved to the other screen because I wanted to see the name William Schultz, but anybody have a problem with that? I think it's interesting because Mr. Schultz, who is of course formerly the executive director of Amnesty USA, was of the opinion that there are times when absolutely we cannot stay our hand, that we must intervene, that is the only choice, that we cannot permit, horrors like, of course, the Holocaust of World War II to go forward. Is he wrong? Anybody care to dispute that? Laura, what do you think?
I agree with him. I think that humanitarian intervention is justifiable, especially in cases like the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide, when there's clearly a group of people being targeted by the institutions in their country and by a majority group in their country, or even a minority group if that's the case. I think that in those cases, that's why internationalism is important, and that's why intervention is reasonable.
Okay. But, as RX rightly points out, nonetheless, it should be subject to scrutiny, and we will get to that in a minute. Okay. So although there are many reasons for pursuing human rights in foreign policy, American foreign policy in particular, but not exclusively, perhaps the most important one is that human rights are important to our, that is to say, American national identity, and as Andrew has pointed out, and also the identities of at least most of the English-speaking nations, and probably others as well. Certainly Scandinavia feels strongly as well. So, in the case of the United States, when we were isolationist, we saw ourselves as a beacon on the hill that leads by example. That actually comes from, what was it? There's a speech, I believe it is by Cotton, that literally makes reference to that is our role in the world, to lead by example. When we were forced, however, to become part of the world, particularly during World War II, the more common view was that the United States should be actively involved on behalf of human rights. There are powerful communities of interest within the US that concern themselves with human rights, as we well know. Moreover, we should not ignore the long-term cost of too close of an association with rights abusing regimes, which also raises the obvious and difficult question, and that is the question of engagement. So do we do what Henry Kissinger would have taught us to do? We'll put aside the bombing of North Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos for a minute. His argument is that if we want change, we must engage. We must, interact with the parties that we hope to see change in, because if we merely isolate them, all that happens is that their behavior becomes worse, not better. Anyone care to speak to that? Is engagement the better choice, or is isolating a state as a pariah the better choice? Obviously, this goes straight to North Korea. May I pick on you, Grant?
Sure. I was just like the guy who just said the shining city on a hill. According to this book I had was Theodore Parker, and he was and even then he was talking about that it should be spread not through imperialism, but just through example that people are born in free and equal in rights. So I think that the president's idea of trying to start nuclear war over Twitter would not be beneficial.
Although it certainly is a form of engagement, but I think not quite what Henry Kissinger would have advised, right?
I would hope not. But yeah, and the downside too is I don't know. Yeah, I think that human rights should serve as a baseline, and that intervention though doesn't always ensure human rights. Such as in Iraq with the Iraq invasion, even when we tried to put in like a friendly government that would respect democracy, they started going after the Christians in the area. And then with North Korea, who knows what will fill the vacuum if the Kims go? Who knows?
So you don't think necessarily the removal of the current head of state would result in a better outcome? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I don't think so, because it could, but it also could result in some kind of North Korean ISIS, which would be awful. because you never know who's going to fill a vacuum in a particular state. It could be a great democratic government with institutions, but
So
that
you're making the
requires another
argument then,
bottom-up
Grant,
process.
you're making the argument which many have made that we, for all intents and purposes, created ISIS when we took down Saddam Hussein. Is that your
I
argument?
think that we created a vacuum.
Okay. That we
and then
unsuccessfully tried to
ISIS
fill.
filled it. Yeah, and then they were able to jump into a vacuum. And I think that creating a vacuum could elevate good things, that it could elevate genuinely awful things.
But should we be therefore afraid of change? I mean, granted that ISIS is pretty horrible, but Saddam Hussein was pretty horrible. Do we just continue to dance with the devil we know, or do we undertake to change things? I mean, there are always unforeseen consequences to the attempt to change, right?
Yes. But I think that we shouldn't be afraid of change, but we should be afraid of possibly forceful change.
Okay.
Such as complete regime overthrow. Like Operation Provide Comfort in Kurdistan after the incidents at Halabja where he just decided to start gassing the Kurds. Like Operation Provide Comfort did stop attacks in Kurdistan and allowed them to create an autonomous region, which now is going down because of the independence referendum. But for 20 years it worked. So I think that
well, you of course know that Turkey,
opportunity.
Grant, you of course know that Turkey is utterly opposed to Kurdistan because of their fear that their own Kurdish area will likely attempt to secede and join Kurdistan, right?
Yeah, and that's why we didn't support their referendum.
Right. Which I think is pretty shitty, frankly, because if you look back in time, there was a time when we promised the Kurds their own state, and then we withdrew that promise. I believe that was as a product of World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, right?
Yeah,
we were slicing
British.
and dicing.
The British like to make all kinds of those promises that then they don't follow through on.
And so we created a wound, really, in terms of the Kurds who continue to hope for their own state, right? And oddly, of course, you know, Israel was the sole supporter of the Kurdish referendum, right?
Mm-hmm.
For obvious reasons, they shared their interests, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, okay, so moving forward, what about trade-offs? Since human rights involve trade-offs, the question then becomes, how much do states value international human rights? A state may have human rights at the bottom of its priorities, in which case it may be unwilling to sacrifice any interest in favor of human rights. In the alternative, a state may have human rights at the top of its priority list, in which case it is willing to subordinate all other concerns that conflict with human rights. Obviously, the second case is highly unrealistic. Most, if not all, states lie toward the minimalist edge of this continuum. If you compare the human rights records of Carter and Reagan, which we're going to do in a minute or two, national security is likely always to outrank human rights. States may, however, occasionally give higher priority to human rights than economic interests. What about the choice of means? Although there are a multitude of economic and diplomatic sanctions, international human rights are seldom pursued with force, although, as we know, not never. Even where humanitarian intervention takes place, states are reluctant to risk the lives of their own nationals in international humanitarian actions. Strong economic sanctions also remain exceptional. We may be prepared, however, to pay more in money than we are prepared to pay in lives. Aid is more regularly used to pursue international human rights objectives. Although when we go to the Reagan versus Carter case, we'll see that it's not clear that breaks down as one might anticipate. Accordingly to Donnelly, aid is primarily used in a punitive fashion, that is, by depriving a state of aid. Some states have also tried to reward regimes that have human rights protective regimes. Even if state support for human rights is limited to rhetoric, speaking out against human rights abuses have been an impact on the global normative environment. States may also support local activists and more broadly civil societies that are capable of opposing authoritarian states. But here we get back to RX's point, right? And that is, why are we supporting the civil society in another state? What is our ultimate goal? would you trust it? Look at how we've responded to Russia. What have they done that is so evil? They engaged in, basically propaganda, and they targeted on the United States, something notably the United States has been doing since time immemorial. Radio liberty. So why do we regard the attempt to influence our domestic affairs with such furor, really, in a way that even though it directly mirrors our own behaviors vis-a-vis other states? Anybody care to speak to that? What is so darned upsetting? So, apart from the fact that some of the stuff that they generated was plainly false, but why was that so upsetting, that we were manipulated by the Russians to some greater or lesser degree? There's no indication, for instance, that they actually did get in and manipulate our electoral system directly, that is to say, mess with our computers that were counting the votes. So what was so distressing that Russia wanted to have a say about our election of a president? My niece decided to leave the United States. She became a citizen of New Zealand, but she did say that there is this perception that the president has such an impact on the entirety of the world that basically everybody should have the opportunity to vote on who's to be the next president. So, is that crazy? Is she wrong? Isn't it inevitable that other states would want to impact elections at the national level, the federal level? Andrew, you're sitting there. I know you are. You must have something to say.
I think that's one of the frustrations that the rest of the world has with the type of power that the United States does have over the international system. They sort of feel that, like you said, the president has such a great influence over the way the world affairs operate during his tenure, but only a small fraction of the global population actually has a say in who that is. And I think that's one of the reasons why when the United States electorate does vote in somebody who is deemed to be, more interventionist and less multilateralist, like George W. Bush or possibly Trump, the rest of the world is sort of aghast at what that could possibly mean for their own safety and their own way of life. So I guess it's not totally unreasonable for people to have like this knee-jerk desire to have some sort of say, if that answers your question.
So do you think it's sort of hypocritical of us to complain of Russia wanting to have an impact on American elections when plainly we try to have an impact on elections the world over? Openly, Obama goes off to wasn't it Obama who went off at the time that they were voting on Brexit, trying to influence the outcome of that?
Said that they shouldn't vote to leave the European Union because it would be detrimental to the UK's relationship with the US.
So who the hell cares what Obama says? And yet, he was actually invited to influence that outcome.
Right. I guess in the broadest sense, it probably is hypocritical because we want to reserve the right to intervene in other states' affairs, but because we're the hegemon, we don't want anyone else to do it for us. But
so what if Putin had come here?
I think in this particular instance, though, it's more frustrating to Americans because it was a country that intervened, that potentially intervened in our elections to undermine our influence. That's why it's more questionable and more seen as more of a threat to the sanctity of the American state. But doesn't mean it's not.
So Andrew, may I say something?
Sure.
And I'd like you to respond. What if Putin had done what Obama did with Brexit? What if Putin had come here and he had given an address at this or that institution and said, for these reasons you should support Donald Trump rather than Hillary Clinton, and let me give you my reasons why.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the fact that they did it sort of undercover that was distressing? I mean, would we have been more or less resistant if Putin had come and expressed his opinion to citizens of the United States?
I have a couple thoughts on that. I think if it had been another head of state that wasn't the Russian head of state. Like, for instance, if the British Prime Minister, French President came and openly just said, I was invited to come here and give my thoughts on in some public forum about your upcoming election, then I don't think it would have been seen as problematic. There would probably be still some sectors probably on the right who would not appreciate those remarks, but they wouldn't be treated as a visceral threat the way that Putin probably would.
Yeah, but it's the people on the left that are treating the Putin as the visceral threat, not the people on the right.
Well, it's interesting. I think at the elite level, both people on the right and the left, the people who sort of have an interest in the status quo of maintaining a generally liberal internationalist direction for the United States and the world as a whole, are concerned by Putin's intervention because they see Russia as an actor that wants to undermine that status quo, wants to create another vision of world order that might not be as beneficial for American and Western interests.
So let me ask you a question, Andrew. Is Putin's desire to increase the role of Russia in terms of its influence on the world order inherently flawed? Is it inherently wrong?
It's probably not inherently flawed because we have to have some sort of universal standard by which to judge it by, but certainly from the American perspective, the more liberal, democratic perspective, it's seen as a threat to the very values that define our version of modernity, as sort of I talked about earlier.
So you think
in many ways it is seen by the policymaking elite as an existential threat to the American way of life and the American-led world. Whereas I'm not sure people in the general public, to the point you raised earlier, necessarily feel that way. Because you're seeing in the Republican Party, the voters don't necessarily view Putin in the same way as the typical leaders do. That's a big fracture point in the party right now. You see people who were sort of more aligned with the Bush administration and have been around for a long time in the Republican Party. They're appalled that their own voters all of a sudden are embracing Russia or seem to be warming up to Russia.
But why is that so wrong? I mean, the reality is we have never been at war with Russia. The reality is that but for Russia's role in World War II, that war would surely have been lost. And in fact, we would have been a very different world indeed. So why? The reality is also that the former Soviet Union chose to give up communism, embraced liberalism. I mean, imperfectly, God knows, but I would suggest that that's just as true of the United States, perhaps to a lesser extent, but just as true of the United States as it is of the former Soviet Union. Why is it that we feel this continuing need to kick sand in Putin's face, but more broadly Russia's face?
Well,
dance on the grave of the USSR. What is that about?
Well, my initial response to what you raised was that I think 20th century history, and maybe to an extent early 21st century history, has to be viewed through the lens of competing forms of internationalism. And the United States and the United Kingdom certainly identified themselves as the leaders of liberal internationalism. And the Second World War was fought against totalitarian internationalism. And then, of course, the Cold War was, the Marxist-Leninist form of totalitarian internationalism. So from an historical standpoint, we do sort of see Russia as the leader of a type of world order that we don't want to have anything to do with.
But what is the world order that he proposes? I mean, apart from Putin being part of it.
Putin has not done that very well. I mean, his human rights record is appalling.
Okay.
He's intervened in other states' affairs. I mean, he's jailed gay people. I mean, it's, the way that he has run his own country is certainly, I would argue, to a greater extent, a violation of liberal...
But if I may stop you there, Andrew, what about the fact that when Putin came on board, Russia was a complete and total disaster, basically run by gangs? I mean, he did clean it up and restore some form of order. Should he not be credited at least with that much?
Okay, that's interesting, actually, because we can all agree that Putin is an authoritarian, and he probably came into power because the Russian people were looking for some sort of strong man leader that could address their concerns. And arguably the same thing is starting to happen here in the United States with Trump. So it perhaps reveals something about the human psyche that humans are willing to jettison lofty ideals such as liberal democracy in the face of economic hardship, or if they feel like their identity and dignity is being challenged in some way. Now,
and isn't that exactly what we were talking about last week, right? Why at this moment in time do we feel the strong man to be appealing? Because obviously we do.
Right. And that's why I think people who are probably more centrist or traditionally liberal in their outlooks are sort of appalled by what's happening right now, because I've always said that I care more about perpetuating the values of liberal democracy than continuous economic growth, perhaps. You know,
and
so
Andrew, can I stop you right there? When you say liberal, do you mean liberal as in on the left, or do you mean liberal as in the theoretical sense of liberal human rights?
A theoretical sense, as in the broadly liberal democratic tradition.
So you're a purist when you talk about being liberal, as am I. But go on. Continue.
Well, I would make the argument that both mainstream Democrats, Republicans, Labor, Conservative, whatever, are still under the tent of liberal in terms of political theory. But we might be seeing one of the parties moving beyond that limit right now in the United States, which is a troubling development.
Okay.
So yes, that's why I broadly say that I am a liberal in the sense that I want to protect the values of liberal democracy and avoid this authoritarian tendency that seems to be happening right now in our politics. So.
I noticed that there was that your Grant, your little blue light keeps coming up like you were about to speak. So speak.
I think that one of the main problems with Russia intervening in our election was that they're not our ally. Barack Obama went to London and talked to them. They're our ally. We are the closest allies for each other. They invited him because we're friends, because we're talking about these things. He's not our ally, and Russia is just there. It's awful.
And that's sort of what I was saying too. Like if the French president had come, or if the British prime minister had come, it wouldn't have been seen in the same way.
Yeah, but guys, let me stop you both. Why isn't Russia our ally? What is so objectionable about Russia becoming an ally? Let me bring you back in time a bit. I believe it was at one of the environmental conferences. We see Putin and Obama sitting in a little tight group together with their translators. And you see Putin, and he's leaning forward, and he's really engaged with Obama. And similar reports have occurred about him and Trump. And he's like really, really intent on, engaging the President of the United States. So, and of course, obviously Obama was trade cool, at that time. So why is it that we are so incredibly unwilling to open the door to friendship with Russia? Can you tell me?
Russia's unwilling to open the door to friendship with us. Every single time he gets criticized, he just turns the sword and says, well, America is terrible, and America doesn't have democracy either. He uses us as a rhetorical ploy. He's not open to friendship, and it's not a democracy.
But look
he
at
announced
that,
he's running for election, he's automatically empowered till 2024.
Grant, look at that body language. That says something. You can't just... I mean, body language really, really matters when you try to figure out what's going on with somebody. It's when someone's leaning forward and they're engaged and they're really engaged. That means something. You can't just disregard it and say, "Oh, he's not sincere." Maybe what's the source of apparent insincerity is that every time he tries to sort of open that door, we repel him again and repel Russia again. Isn't that possible? I mean, he's defending his honor and his ego when he says United States is the problem. Maybe his genuine perception is we are the problem. We won't let him come in.
Well, when he brings this up, he's defending himself killing journalists. He's not defending his ego. And, but him being interested in a conversation doesn't mean he's open to friendship.
Okay. Do you agree with that, Laura? Is that true?
I think it's I think it's more complicated and nuanced than is being led on by this, because I think that if anything, Putin is a very good, like he's authoritarian in Russia, and he has been the leader in Russia for a very long time compared to other world leaders in democratic systems. And I think
how long
he
has
knows
Angela
how to
Merkel
interact
been?
with people.
How long has
I think
Angela Merkel been in office? Anybody know?
Merkel?
Yes.
She's been in office since 2005. So
And how
about
long has
12
Putin
years.
been around?
How long has who been around?
Putin been around.
Oh, I think it's 2000, the year 2000.
Yeah. 2000.
So he's
Yeah.
not that far ahead of Angela Merkel, is he?
Right. But
But to lead off of Laura's point about being a little nuanced, I mean, if I wanted to be charitable to your position that maybe the U.S. should be more open to pursuing friendship with Russia, I think that moment might have existed right at the end of the Cold War. And there are some scholars who think that the United States' unwillingness to incorporate Russia into Europe's security and defense architecture might have provided some of the impetus for why Putin has hostility toward the West. But at this point, I don't see how you can open the door to friendship to Russia if you want to uphold the values of liberal democracy.
So you don't believe in engagement, you believe in isolation? Or
I believe in
isolating
constructive
a
engagement
pariah?
with
Okay.
Russia that could lead them in a more palatable direction, but I don't think we should move ourselves to the Russian position.
Well, I'm
many
not
issues.
suggesting that. I'm not suggesting that at all, but I don't think it follows that, during the Cold War, while we pursued constructive engagement, that we suddenly became a communist power, right? I mean, one doesn't require the other, does it?
No, it doesn't, but
I just think it's difficult to make the argument that they should be allies.
mhm.
Like they don't necessarily need to be treated as enemies, but you can't really say that they're allies when on so many different points they are not on the same position. Like if you look at Syria, and for how many years they have been just completely unable to back the same side to solve the problem, like that kind of situation, you can't call that an alliance if you are constantly pursuing separate foreign policy goals.
Or at least an alliance based on, you can't call it an alliance based on shared values in a way that you would with perhaps France or the UK. But to Laura's point, I sort of feel like there is a degree of hypocrisy in U.S. foreign policy, to be sure. Like, for instance, why are we allies with a regime like Saudi Arabia, which's human rights record is appalling? Is it any worse than Russia's? Probably not. But
And in fact, Putin himself has said, look, I'm not the head of North Korea. I'm considerably different from him, so why do you treat me this way? Was he wrong?
he's not wrong, but like I said earlier, I think it's because the United States does view Russia as an actor in the international system that could undermine the whole of the world order it wants to perpetuate. Whereas Saudi Arabia might not be seen as the same type of thing, or, it's...
Despite its vast wealth.
Right.
Okay, so let's continue. Realists rightly remind us that foreign policy decision makers are required by their office to take into account the national interests that are only partly defined by morality. Moral perfectionism is likely an inappropriate standard for foreign policy, but national interests may include a moral dimension. He acknowledges that risking nuclear war may not be, indeed may never be, an acceptable trade-off for human rights. He further admits that it may be acceptable to intervene in weaker states. These are, in his estimation, the ugly realities of relative power. We're not likely to go off and intervene directly in Russia because, of course, Russia has the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world. These are, in his, as I said, the ugly realities of relative power. Moral inconsistency may be impossible fully to avoid. Apparent inconsistencies, and of course this goes to your point, Andrew, about why are we friends with Saudi Arabia when we're not friends with Russia. Apparent inconsistencies are often the product of weighting of relative priorities with regard to differing cases. So part of the problem is that many actors in foreign policy are called upon to make decisions rapidly, particularly in a world where we have this 24 news hour cycle, right, where things move so rapidly that, and we demand immediate responses by the government, perhaps inappropriately. In fact, that was one of the issues people had with Obama, is he was a thinker, he wanted to sit, he wanted to, absorb the facts, he wanted to make decisions about, really consider all the alternatives and then make a decision about how to go forward. We just lost Andrew for some reason. I presume he will be back. Anyway, so the reality is then that actors, foreign policy actors, are called upon to make decisions rapidly. Moreover, there tend to be internal conflicts between human rights and national security officials who represent different communities of interest within a single government. So one of the big problems always is, and we do this as well, as foreign states do, and that is we keep talking about the United States. The United States did this, the United States did that, when in fact we have different presidents, we have different, we have, and at any given time, different communities of interest are going to have a greater impact on presidential decision making. So it is not entirely obvious why we talk about the United States did thus and such, when in fact it might be more meaningful to talk about the president did thus and such, or what have you. So in the final analysis, while international human rights are working their way up the foreign policy agendas of a growing number of states, in few, if any, have they ever gotten close to the top. And of course he actually leaves open the question, and perhaps they should never be sort of the absolute determining factor in foreign policy decision making. We're going to move on to Reagan v. Carter in a minute, but we finished up a topic and we've been through a little bit more than an hour. So let's go ahead and take a brief break. I think that's why Andrew left us in any event, and I will be back in 5 to 10 minutes, okay? This is Apollo. Apollo says hello. He's a big kitty. Yes. Oh my goodness.
His name is Apollo.
What's the other one's name?
This one back here, this is an earlier generation. This is the N generation. This is Nikita, and her, and then the other cat you saw last time was Neo. So they're the N's, but the newest kitties are all A's. Apollo, his sister, whom we also adopted, is Artemis. And then we have Ashley and Abby. So, anyway. So this big guy, he's just humongous. It's unbelievable. He's not as big as some of the main...
Oh.
Huh? This is only his 2nd year. So he's still a baby, believe it or not. And could plausibly grow even a little bit more before he's finished. Yes. And Nikita is an interesting kitty because she is Nikita of the curly tail. She's holding it out a bit right now, but her tail is mostly curled, which I have never seen on a cat before.
She's so cute.
Yes, she's adorable. She's a sweetheart. When we went to adopt her, she's so tiny. She was sitting on the lady's coffee table, and I was looking around and I said, well, where is the cat? And the lady said, you know, the cat's right there. That's the cat. Oh! So, yes, she's a tiny little girl. And in comparison to certainly Apollo, that's for sure. Okay, so, and the 2 baby cats. We have a gray poof and a little short-haired black kitty cat. The little short-haired black kitty cat was the one who was almost dead when my husband... We had just adopted the gray poof, Ashley, and I would look down the driveway, and if you look in the tapes, you can see we're on the top of a hill. And so I watched my husband come up the hill, and he had something out in front of him like that. And it was dangling there because this poor little cat was so ill, she looked like a little rag. And I said, what have you got, honey? And he comes closer, and of course I see it's a little baby cat that is all but dead. And we've invested hundreds of dollars trying to bring her back to good health, and now she looked like she could have been, you know, 4 or 5 weeks old, and she was already a 4 or 5 month old cat. But she was, you know, just skeletal. She had been bitten by an animal, possibly a dog, but also equally possibly we have coyotes around here. We also have raccoons, opossums. So in any event, she had had a tangle with somebody, and the fur had been ripped off her tail, and she had a infection that was systemic, and she also had a terrible infection in her head. And oh my goodness, she had no fur on her little belly because, you know, she was so malnourished that she couldn't sustain growing fur, and now she's a beautiful little kitty cat, and all is well, except for she still has a bit of a nose drip because we can't seem entirely to conquer her upper respiratory infection. Though God knows, we have tried. We've been working on that for quite a while now. Anyway, so kitties, yes, we love them. We also love dogs. We have a standard poodle, but he's downstairs somewhere. Okay, so how about Reagan v. Carter? For those of you who have read this article, and I assume you have, the outcome is almost certainly a surprise. It is about the relative priority assigned to human rights by the two administrations in their rhetoric and their actual practice. Were any of you guys alive during the Carter administration or the Reagan administration? I don't even know. I lose perspective on this.
Nope.
None of you guys were around?
Yeah.
I was born in '94.
Oh my goodness. I was in law school during the Reagan administration, and I was in graduate school during the Carter administration. But in any event, does anybody know what the whole deal was about Carter, what he was disrespected for? Anybody know, just offhand, without having read the article, if you haven't gotten to it?
I know that when he ran, he said he was promising a foreign policy as good as the American people. It was like based on human rights, and then the Iran hostage crisis happened, and he tried to do an operation that failed miserably because they used helicopters that don't operate well in sand, and it was during a dust storm.
Right, so they got taken down by the dust storm, right? But
Yeah.
but the question is, you know, what was the general opinion of Jimmy Carter's foreign policy? How did they feel he looked to the world? Do you know?
I know he's described as weak.
Is that a fair assessment, or do you think if you go ahead and you give high priority to human rights, does that make you inherently weak?
I don't think it makes you weak. No.
But nonetheless, that was the argument against Jimmy Carter, was that he was weak because he was concerned with American foreign policy, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, and so Ronnie Reagan came in, and as you probably know, the hostages were released like immediately after his swearing in, right? So this whole business about Trump having become involved with the Russians prior to his being sworn in it's not the first time. Nixon did it to Johnson. And Reagan did it to Jimmy Carter. So, and I'm sure there are many other instances. Those are simply the ones that have come to light. So, you know, and of course Reagan, at least during the majority of my lifetime, was deemed to be sort of, you know, something close to, you know, I don't know, Jesus himself, in Republican eyes, and you know, certainly did not get thrown into jail because he had been in obvious contact with the Iranians before he assumed his position as president of the United States. So anyway, the point is that, you know, they part of the election campaign was that, you know, Jimmy's weak. We're not going to be weak like Jimmy. We're going to be strong. We're going to, you know, the whole declaration of the USSR as the evil empire, blah blah blah. The reintroduction of into our rhetoric of words that we had felt were inherently abusive, like evil, occurred during that particular campaign and that administration. Anyway, so for purposes of this article, Carleton and Stoll, who were its authors, adopted the definition provided by the Foreign Assistance Act of 1974, which singles out states that engage in constant patterns of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights for action. Excuse me, God, my glasses need some help here. For action, identifying such violations as torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, prolonged detention without charges, or other flagrant denials of life, liberty, and the security of persons. The Reagan critique of Carter's human rights policy ran as followed. He argued, or his administration argued, that international terrorism was the key human rights concern. The moral issues involved in judging the relative goodness of regimes needed to be clarified. Haig, then Secretary of State, declared, Alexander Haig, that is to say, who then made a fool of himself when Ronnie got shot, declared that international, because he didn't know what the line of succession was in the event that Ronald Reagan was unable to resume his presidency, or during that period of time while he was incapacitated anyway. He declared that international terrorism will take the place of human rights in our concern because it is the ultimate abuse of human rights. Haig repeatedly condemned the Soviets for training and equipping international terrorists. By this means, the Reagan administration effectively bundled human rights, national security, and international terrorism into a single package that fit neatly into the broader fight against global communism. Kirkpatrick, then ambassador to the UN, maintained that the Carter policy was flawed from the start due to its utopian conception of human rights. Moreover, Carter's policies focused on American allies, thereby destabilizing and undermining U.S. allies around the world. In Kirkpatrick's view, Carter neither promoted human rights nor U.S. security interests. He failed to distinguish between totalitarian nations and authoritarian nations. He, for instance, opposed Rhodesia, South Africa, and Pinochet's Argentina. Kirkpatrick argued that there were no grounds for expecting radical totalitarian regimes to transform themselves, but a mere authoritarian regime could still become a democracy. The Reagan administration's argument was that true human rights policies lend support to authoritarian regimes in order to minimize the evil power of totalitarianism. In practice, authoritarian regimes were those that were friendly to the US, while totalitarian regimes were those authoritarian regimes that were not. The most significant problem, and this concerns measuring human rights violations, the most significant problem with human rights violations is getting information about them at all, since violators do not go out of their way to tell, and press coverage is in fact uneven. This is, of course, an even bigger problem when we get to our next article in connection with the Third World, where it's very difficult to insert the press to find out what's going on. The authors rely upon three sources. First, Freedom House, which ranks every state, or did at that time, on a civil rights scale. The authors use this information even though they think it is methodologically weak. They also use a second scale established by Freedom House. This distinguishes between states that use political killings, torture, and imprisonment, and those who do not. Using this index, the authors collected data from the U.S. Department of State and Amnesty International. Finally, the authors compared their findings to see if a country's human rights records correlated with the level of foreign assistance that they, in fact, received. Looking to Carter, from the beginning of the Carter administration, he spoke to the central role that human rights would play in foreign policy. He was supportive of Congress's efforts to codify its human rights concerns. Some have contended, however, that Carter's human rights policy was long on rhetoric and short on action. The data on Carter's policy and existing legislation required a negative relationship between aid and human rights violations, but in fact the opposite was true. The aid stick was used sparingly by the Carter administration. It did, however, cut off aid to Argentina, Bolivia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Nicaragua, Paraguay, and Uruguay. All 8, obviously, were in Latin America. In the cases of Brazil, El Salvador, Guatemala, Argentina, and Uruguay, they refused further aid from the U.S. in response to the Department of State's bad reports. Now, obviously, this was a case of you can't fire me because I'm going to quit. The truth was that the Carter administration did not significantly withdraw material aid from repressive U.S. friends and made ample use of the exceptional circumstance clause written into the human rights legislation. The Reagan critique was therefore misdirected. Carter did not punish U.S. friends while allowing U.S. enemies to remain unscathed. But listen to this list. Going back a minute, he, in fact, was concerned with Rhodesia, South Africa. I need to go back a bit further, I think. and Pinochet's Argentina. So who was on the wrong side of history here? Anybody? Was he weak for opposing these regimes? There is silence in the house. Not a word. Shall I ask this guy here, Apollo? He might have an answer. Oh, come on, you guys. Laura, what do you think?
I think it's easy to criticize past politicians with the hindsight 2020. I think if you were to consider it from his perspective of what he was attempting to do and what his intention was, and what he was actually trying to support through his policies, which obviously, I think in the article it even said the Carter administration was single-mindedly committed to human rights, but short on action. And so I think that there's just a disconnect between, especially in the Cold War, there was a disconnect.
Okay, so what you're saying, yeah, but back up here. What you're saying is Jimmy didn't do enough. But what I'm asking you is, what do you think about the Reagan administration's argument that Jimmy did too much? In point of fact, the Reagan administration was unwilling to, for instance, oppose apartheid in South Africa because of the argument that South Africa was at located at a strategic position at the Horn of Africa. and that we needed their support if we were to continue to oppose the USSR.
Exactly. So I think that the difference is that the Reagan administration was trying to shift foreign policy more back towards security and like geopolitics, maybe more so than Carter had been trying to do. So I think that the question isn't whether he was weak, but it's just going toward a different goal policy-wise. Like Reagan was very clearly campaigning on the interests of national security, and so not intervening in apartheid in South Africa was
it made sense in that context.
It made sense in that context of policymaking.
So did we have to be that consistent? Couldn't we have, slapped him a little bit about the ears and say, hey, this is not okay?
Oh, I would say yes. I think that something definitely should have been said or done to say that that was not okay. But also, in that time period, it would probably be a difficult stance for the United States to take with its own civil rights issues going on.
Oh, so you think then we were reluctant to do something about apartheid because we were nasty SOBs anyway, and we actually identified with South Africa?
Stance.
What?
I think it might appear to be kind of a hypocritical stance at that point in history.
Wow. Were we that bad at that time?
Well, oh no, obviously not that bad, not to the same extent as South Africa. But when the United States makes any kind of human rights comment in the international system, people automatically are going to point at the United States and try to figure out what they can pin on them in return. So that could have also been a part of it. I'm not sure.
Okay. Anybody else care to comment? RX, you've been quiet there for a while. What do you have to say?
I'm not very sure. I mean, I think we can't blame the policy of politician. If they didn't put human rights in their priority, I think because of their position. I really don't know what I want to express.
Okay. Grant, how about you? What do you got to say?
About Carter versus Reagan?
Yeah, I mean, was Carter wrong to prioritize human rights to the degree he did? Was Reagan wrong to deprioritize human rights in connection, say, with South Africa and Rhodesia, and of course Pinochet's Argentina, which of course all three of those violations were pretty horrific, I should say. No?
I think that I'm not sure because Carter made compromises too, like with Iran and backing the Shah. Mm-hmm. He's a big fan of the Shah.
He wasn't a big fan of the Shah. The thing that he did with the Shah is when the Shah fell, because he was dying of cancer, Carter let him enter the United States to get appropriate treatment for the cancer. I mean, which of course they made a big to-do about, but he was not necessarily a big fan of the Shah or Savak or anything of the sort.
Well, prior to the Iranian Revolution, he said that due to the leadership of the Shah, that Iran was a pillar of stability in an otherwise fraught region. He was a pretty big fan of the Shah, and the Shah even said that he's never heard a nicer word said of him by a foreign leader. And so I think that I agree with Laura, and then I think that Reagan had very different goals. It's security or values, and Carter had values, and I think that values are important, and I think that security is important. I do think that Reagan overdid it in several ways, such as with South Africa, and with Pinochet.
Okay.
But I think that I think there has to be a balance of values versus security, and it doesn't mean that you're weak if you put values first, and it doesn't mean that you're strong if you only use security. it has to be balanced and it has to be wise and measured.
By the way, Matt, I feel compelled to look this up now, because it was certainly, I lived through that time. It was not my impression that he thought that the Shah was a great guy, but I could, of course, be wrong. I mean, my head was obviously in other places at the time. Anyway, so from the beginning of the Carter administration, he spoke to the central role that human rights would play in foreign policy. He was, as I said, supportive of Congress's effort to codify those concerns. But nonetheless, the truth was that he actually, the data does not support the idea that he did not provide aid to states that were friendly to us to the degree that the Reagan administration claimed. Now, under the Freedom House scale, Reagan came out just about the same as Carter. Now, that's the curiosity. Indeed, Reagan appeared initially to have demonstrated more consistency than Carter. The problem is that the apparent consistency could be the result of bringing state human rights reports into line with the desired aid collection distribution. So, you know, they fudged it on the State Department reports in order to support Reagan's foreign policy. So the objectivity of the country reports became increasingly questionable. The Freedom House and Amnesty International correlation showed little or no change. The State Department correlations alone changed significantly, raising serious questions, as I said, as to the latter's validity. In practice, however, Reagan's human rights policy regarding aid distribution does not appear overall to be significantly different from the Carter human rights policy in terms of the tools that were used to influence states that had authoritarian regimes. The other point that ought certainly to be made here is that Carter believed in the use of public rhetoric to influence human rights, whereas Reagan maintained that he preferred to work behind the scenes. So that makes it rather difficult, really, to meaningfully analyze who was doing what, right? Because if you were quietly working behind the scenes, does that mean that you're doing nothing at all? Or how important is the use of rhetoric? Could the use of, could working quietly behind the scenes ultimately be more effective because you're not embarrassing the state whom you're asking to change its behavior?
I sort of...
Andrew, go ahead.
I sort of think that working behind the scenes is probably the wiser option, because in terms of situations that might be extremely delicate in terms of the diplomacy that needs to be done, because if you bring it out into the open in every situation, then you're, and I hate to sound like an elitist in making this argument, but when you bring it out into the open and you then have public perceptions of these events and public responses to these events, it can lead to, like you said, embarrassment, misunderstanding.
Loss of face.
Yes, so that could just make the things more complicated than they would otherwise be. So yeah, that's why I think it's probably just general, like in these situations that might require a great deal of tact and subterfuge to keep it somewhat low-key.
So you are saying that perhaps Reagan was the wiser actor, or at least his administration was the wiser actor in this case?
Perhaps in this particular case. But it's still important, at least in publicly, to justify, like you said, maybe through rhetoric, the human rights aims that you're trying to achieve. Because no matter what policy is at play, whether hidden or overt, there has to be some sort of justification for the overall direction that a government is pursuing in terms of its foreign relations.
Okay. In any event, the whole point was that they made a distinction between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Clearly, there is a gulf between human rights rhetoric and human rights actions in U.S. politics. The Reagan critique of Carter's human rights policy was nonetheless inadequate. His basis for the distinction, or his administration's basis for the distinction between authoritarianism and totalitarianism, was that the latter represented a more evil form of tyranny because such regimes claim jurisdiction over an entire society. Authoritarians, by contrast, were only interested in staying in power and did not disturb other social institutions. Notably, this was also the view of John Paul II, who was Pope at the time, and who was also a major actor on the international stage. His views on authoritarian regimes accounted for why he was not as beloved in Latin America as he was in the rest of the world. He was happy with any Latin American regime that did not presume to interfere with the church. He also ordered an end to his pre-support for liberation theology, which focused on Jesus not only as the Redeemer, but also as the liberator of the poor and oppressed. Because many priests were willing to collaborate with communists in order to better the lot of their parishioners, John Paul II ordered his priests out of politics, and this apparently devastated many Latin American communities who saw their priests as heroes. In any case, this distinction between authoritarianism and totalitarianism does not bear rational scrutiny. As an examination of the political realities of the countries identified by the Reagan administration as totalitarian governments did not and could not control all social institutions because they did not, in fact, have the resources to do so. As to those regimes that Reagan identified as authoritarian, they frequently moved beyond political institutions and attacked social institutions as well. And indeed, if you go back to the case of John Paul II, who basically said, either get out of politics or you will be defrocked, the reality was that they had engaged their governments, they had been subject to torture and abuse of various sorts. So plainly, it is not true that these Latin American authoritarian regimes were unwilling to cross the line and harm social institutions, specifically, of course, the church, which was the predominant moral authority in Latin America at the time. As to those regimes that Reagan identified as authoritarian, as I said, they frequently moved beyond political institutions. A final point to be considered regarding the Reagan administration's human rights rhetoric was its characterization of international terrorism as the ultimate abuse of human rights. If human rights abuses are measured in terms of actual numbers of deaths, those attributable to human rights abuses far exceeded those attributable to terrorism at the time of the Reagan administration, and almost certainly continues to be true. How then could terrorism be viewed objectively as a more serious violation of human rights? Reagan's rhetorical arguments ran into political opposition that required that they be played down. The rhetoric of the Reagan administration generated political opposition that he toned down some of these claims. Overall, his rhetoric regarding human rights was plainly strained. So as with the Carter administration, Reagan did very little by way of redirecting U.S. foreign assistance as required by federal statute. This fact may again be explained by the invocation of the extraordinary circumstances escape clause. The Reagan administration also gave very creative interpretations of the terms consistent and pattern of gross violations of human rights. In the case of countries which Reagan wished to give assistance, his administration would either argue that its human rights violations were not consistent or did not represent a pattern, and therefore the law did not apply. The upshot of this is neither administration denied foreign assistance in the manner required by the relevant congressional legislation. Undoubtedly, the inclusion of the exceptional circumstances clause represented the tacit recognition by Congress at the time that there were concerns other than human rights that might impinge upon foreign aid decisions. Under both administrations, in the competition between various foreign aid interests, there were few cases in which human rights concerns were judged as compelling. In the Carter administration, once a specific interest of some substantiality was cited, the exception was almost automatically invoked. Despite its rhetoric, however, the Carter administration was never actually willing to wager a potential political or security risk in favor of human rights. Nevertheless, the Carter policy had a positive impact on Latin America. Shortly after assuming office, Reagan removed bans on several forms of aid to Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Carter did give greater weight to human rights than many other non-security related concerns, but the overriding fact is that both administrations always found security concerns more important than human rights. Further, The authors admit that it is not entirely fair to judge Reagan by criteria of which he disapproved. He consistently stated he did not approve of using foreign assistance in the manner prescribed by the human rights legislation, but as I've already said, preferred quiet diplomacy instead. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church has been faulted for this approach as well. As you undoubtedly know, and particularly Andrew, our historian, is aware, the Roman Catholic Church claimed that they did oppose the Holocaust, but they did it quietly and behind the scenes. And of course, this has never been received in a positive way by particularly America's Jewish community. So, Reagan attributed the loss of Iran and Nicaragua to Carter's human rights policy. Reagan also cited Brazil's cancellation of its mutual assistance pact with the U.S. as a negative outcome of Carter's human rights policy. Further, he cited the reduction of U.S. influence in Argentina, Guatemala, and South Africa as all negative ramifications of Carter's policy. On the other hand, the moderate course of government in Zimbabwe during its early years and the release of many political prisoners could reasonably be attributed to Carter. So it is difficult, as I have said, to evaluate the effectiveness of Reagan's quiet diplomacy. In the aggregate, the authors could not say that Reagan's human rights policy, at least as measured by statistical variance, was noticeably more or less effective than Carter's policy. What could be said is that the Reagan administration had very little impact through constructive engagement either in El Salvador or South Africa. The authors also cited the effectiveness of Carter's rhetoric on the victims themselves. And this, of course, is very much a constructivist argument, although it was not, that particular theory was not big at the time that this was written. Many victims who were released stated that they would never forget Carter's contribution to the battle for human rights. While Carter's policy may have failed because he raised expectations too high, Reagan's policy offered no hope to the victims of human rights abuses at all. So what do you think? Was the rhetoric itself important? Simply the rhetoric? Does rhetoric have an impact, and should we listen to those who were victims of human rights abuses who said he gave them hope? Do you think rhetoric has an impact, or is it impactful in any way?
I think rhetoric does affect the way people perceive things like human rights abuses, and that's a very important part of creating like a global consciousness towards opposing them. Like, adding to the public discourse that there are these concerns, that there are these people out there who are like you, who are suffering in a way that you can't imagine, kind of creates an image that then people will hopefully try to prioritize in their democratic choices and in their policies that will then follow.
Okay, so you think that perhaps there's a role for rhetoric in as much as it potentially enlightens people as to what is happening abroad and the kinds of
I think you can't argue against that, especially because the opposite is what we're witnessing right now, because everybody knows that rhetoric matters because we're seeing terrible, awful, negative rhetoric that is infesting everybody's news feeds and tweets and headlines. And I think that kind of shows the opposite effect of negative rhetoric. It stirs a reaction, it enters public discussion, and I think that's kind of what rhetoric does.
Okay, so we cannot simply be disregarded. What we say matters.
Yes, and what politicians say
in particular matters.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so we have only the Una Hathaway article to do. Thought we could take one more brief break. I know it's 2:29, and I think we can finish up in a half an hour. But if we go a few minutes over, are you guys cool with that? Since we don't have to give up our classroom. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to take a 5-minute break. Please feel free to do likewise, and then we'll finish up for the day, okay? So, forgive me for playing devil's advocate for most of this conversation. I personally adored Jimmy. It was interesting because in my family, the first election my sister was permitted to vote in, she voted for Jimmy Carter. My mother and father, who were, at least at that point, dyed-in-the-wool Republicans, totally flipped out. I remember this huge fight between my sister and my mom concerning the merits of Jimmy Carter. And my mom was absolutely certain that casting a vote for Jimmy Carter was going to lead to the destruction of the country. I personally embraced the view of a friend of mine who herself is a Southerner but also a progressive person. And it was her argument that the problem with Jimmy was that maybe Jimmy was just too good. And I may have said this to you guys before in the sense of, you know, too good genuinely to be bad enough to, say, take down the Soviet Union. Hard to say. What I can say, and what we certainly all know, is that Jimmy Carter has become, or for the rest of his life, has become a huge force in human rights, and perhaps more effective in that role as senior statesman than he was in the role of president, because of course there was so much opposition to him at that time. Anyway, so let's turn to Oona Hathaway. What of human rights on the other side? That is, the states that voluntarily or through compulsion adopt human rights instruments. Does it make a difference? Oona Hathaway tries to test two propositions. First, do countries comply with requirements of human rights treaties they have joined? And two, are human rights treaties effective in improving human rights practices? Clearly, they're closely related questions. First, let's look at the statistical findings. She found that taken together, the results for the group of universal treaties indicate the treaty ratification is usually not associated with a statistically significant difference in human rights ratings from what would have been otherwise expected. Worse still, when ratification is associated with significantly different human rights ratings, it is associated with worse rather than better human rights ratings than would otherwise have been expected. So what does this mean? There is, in her view, an expressive function of treaties that can actually explain why why states can simultaneously sign on to human rights treaties and yet there be a continuing lack of compliance, even a worse record of compliance than before signing the treaty. Hathaway maintains that treaties operate on two levels. They create law that is intended to have certain effects, and they express the position of those who join them. In short, treaties play both instrumental and expressive roles. Human rights treaties work by expressing the position of the community of nations as to what conduct is and is not acceptable. An additional expressive function takes place when the state joins the human rights treaty, in that they embrace the view of the international community, at least theoretically. The international, meaning trying to effect an outcome, and expressive roles of treaties do not work together seamlessly. Where monitoring and enforcement is minimal, the expressive aspect becomes divorced from the instrumental aspect. Because their human rights violations are not likely to be exposed, countries often join a treaty in order to enjoy the expressive benefits of joining without complying. By joining treaties, states can be relieved of pressure for real change, because monitoring systems are obviously inadequate. Already overtaxed human rights organizations are left with the job of exposing violations. Thus, for instance, states that want to attract investors can use treaty ratification to placate a corporate investor stockholders back home. They can also use treaty ratification to gain the pleasure of nations wishing to provide aid or deepen political and economic ties. In short, treaty ratification has become a substitute for real improvements in human rights. This is not to say that some leaders may not actually ratify these treaties with the genuine intent of bringing about change. However, they may not be able to bring along other branches of the government or lower levels of the administration, for instance, the police. The expressive benefit in part results from the fact that some parties actually do abide by treaties, and it is difficult to distinguish between those who do not, and those between those who do and those who do not. Accordingly, those with the worst records gain the most benefit by joining treaties, thereby improving their reputation with other states and possible investors. Ratification of a treaty is obviously easy to ascertain. You just go to the UN site, you look up their name, and you see what treaties they have joined. The fact is, to actual compliance is often much more difficult to verify. So what do you think? Do you find her argument persuasive? Is that why states may be party to treaties but not in fact comply with them? Because it looks good, basically, to be a party. And should we flip that over and look at the United States and say, why is it that the United States does not join treaties, human rights treaties? Are they not interested in both aspects, the instrumental and expressive functions of human rights treaties? RX, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think it is an issue that there are countries that are not willing to ratify treaty or implement treaty. Like there's a problem with CEDAW, lots of countries, 180 something countries have signed this treaty, but there is report that these countries did not really implement the treaty well. So I think there is an issue that countries sign the treaty to look good, to save face, instead of really want to make some change, to realize the object of the treaty. But also I think the change that treaties can make is not like an instant difference, but it's a long and gradual process. Like once a country signed a treaty, maybe within years, there may not be material change on its human rights protection. But with years past, this treaty can, with more and more recognition from the countries, this treaty can become customary international law, or a standard that are binding among the international society. So I think that's the way how the treaties can make a change.
So you think you have to take the long view of treaties rather than, everything has to change the moment you sign a treaty?
Yeah, I think we should take the long view.
What do you think, by the way, RX, of what's going on in Saudi Arabia? Have you followed that at all? Have any of you followed that? RX,
I'm not very familiar with that.
Laura, what do you think? Have you followed what's going on with Saudi Arabia?
Not very closely, no, not enough to really comment on it.
Okay, either of you guys have any insights?
About the women being allowed to drive, or about his corruption crusade?
Yeah, but there's an additional thing. He's making it easier for women to go into public and to mix with the opposite sex in public settings. Isn't that kind of wow?
That's very encouraging for sure, especially in Saudi Arabia. So that's definitely a positive development, and that's the one I think downside about his corruption drives, is that it makes you have to question them when you don't want to question them when they're doing these things that are objectively good as well. And so it's hard.
And why do you say that in terms of the Crown Prince doing this corruption drive? Because he apparently is the person who is largely responsible for the easing up of rules vis-a-vis women in Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. I say that because to criticize the way he's running his military or the royal family could just imply that you disagree with his opening up, which the opening up is fantastic, should continue, and should frankly have happened years ago.
So it's exciting, isn't it? I mean, I find it really exciting what's going on.
Yeah, I honestly never thought it would happen in my lifetime. So, Um, so that's good. So you have to do it. It has to be a measured criticism because he's created a humanitarian crisis in Yemen, but he's also done these great things, and so it has to be a measured criticism.
Well, isn't that true of every human being, though? I mean,
Yes.
and for that matter, of the history of every country. I mean, if you look at the United States, we've done some pretty horrific things over the course of our history, and yet, when we would wish also to embrace the good things that we have done, and I would suggest not merely allegedly, but genuinely have done good things during the history of the United States. So, how do you deal with that, Andrew? Does it bother you that, on the one hand he's doing this good stuff, and then on the other hand, as Grant suggested, he's also created this humanitarian crisis in Yemen?
How do you like reconcile those two seemingly oppositional elements? I really don't know. I mean, it's there's only so much I think you can blame one person for.
Okay.
I always try to take that into account, especially when there's so many like complicated historical and like cultural elements at play here. But I still think like the overarching principle should not be to inject more venom into a situation that's already very tense. So, yeah.
Okay. But, Lord, having heard what we just discussed, don't you feel at least a level of excitement that big things are going on in Saudi Arabia, whatever else may be happening?
I think that the positive things can't be discounted. Like, I think it's human nature for sure to be a leader and do some actions that are questionable and some actions that are laudable. So certainly it's good to be excited about improvements for women in Saudi Arabia, but that does not remove the responsibility to put pressure on a leader to apply those principles to other areas of policymaking.
Okay, fair enough. But perhaps RX is right here that, if we take the long-term view of treaties, that we will ultimately see change even if we are disappointed in the short run. Do you think she's correct about that? I mean, does what's happening in Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis women suggest she's right?
I think so, yeah, because I think one of the things about international law and customary law is the normalization of certain principles. And while that doesn't happen immediately, the fact that these institutions actively exist is what's going to make certain norms practiced more widely than they would if it wasn't even a part of international discussion.
Okay, so that brings us back again to the rhetoric issue, right, with regard to Carter, that international discussion matters, right?
I think it does. Yeah.
Anybody differ with her in that? I will assume silence means that you all concur. So what about the lack of compliance with regional treaties? Why is ratification of regional treaties often associated with a worse human rights performance? Ratification of regional human rights treaties are largely a product of regional political and economic interdependence. This interdependence creates greater incentives for countries to express their commitment to community norms, even when they are unable or unwilling to meet those commitments. Membership brings with it an array of economic and political benefits, and exclusion at the regional level poses real dangers. Accordingly, these dangers can be soothed not merely through actual compliance, but also through the toothless expression of adherence. Now, can we look for or expect a different outcome with compliance among democracies? Disingenuousness among democracies is far less likely because the norms in question are already internalized, and this kind of goes back to what Andrew was saying previously about the fact that the sort of Anglo states, particularly the UK and the US, want to promote these very values, and they deem these values to be part of their internal culture. Moreover, states have greater difficulty engaging expressions inconsistent with their actions. What would that be? Why is it that we have greater difficulty acting inconsistently with the values that we allegedly hold? What's different?
Is it perhaps that maybe many of those values are aspirational and not actually a reflection of how things operate on a day-to-day basis?
So you are suggesting that we don't necessarily act consistently with our alleged values. Is that what you're saying?
It's a possibility.
Okay, and to some degree that must necessarily be true, because certainly we are aware that the United States has engaged in human rights violations during the course of its history and probably continues to do so now. But the obvious other part of this is that we are concerned because, or it's more difficult to do these things because such behaviors are readily revealed by institutions such as the free press. So what's all the hoopla about what's going on with the free press now? Is that, first of all, do you really feel that the freedom of the press is being seriously constrained right now? And secondly, if it is that a concern? If the press has become a propaganda mill, and I think that we can say that at least two instances, both on the left and the right, are probably a little more than propaganda mills. If those behaviors are stopped, is that a horrible thing? Should we be going back to a time when we were all working from the same factual base and agreed upon facts, and then we interpreted them from our ideological perspectives? Or are both sides engaged in making up facts to some greater or lesser degree, as they have been accused of doing?
I don't think it's possible at this point to go back to a time when multiple news sources didn't exist. Like, at this point, since we have the internet, since we have access not only to this country's news, but to other countries' news sources, and people are capable of writing their own blogs and creating their own small websites if they are interested in doing that, I think it's improbable that this problem is going to just be solved by returning to a simpler time. But I would agree that mass media is, and the press is under attack, and that is at least constraining its ability to reach a wide audience. Like, at this point in history, no liberal-minded person, and by liberal I mean like Democrat Party, is going to take seriously what Fox News posts.
Yeah, but on the other hand, no Republican would take seriously MSNBC.
CNN.
Or CNN. You feel CNN should be included in this, not just MSNBC, which is quite clearly ideologically left-leaning. But you think CNN has left the sort of the center and moved to the left?
I think that CNN gets criticized for it. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
I think CNN gets criticized for it, but I think that CNN does better investigative work than Fox News does, as opposed to just having Hannity go on and shout for an hour. But
yeah, I certainly didn't mean to equate those as if they were like both good news sources. But I'm just saying that I don't think that they're gonna reach a wide audience, and so in that way, the public press is like.
Yeah, and I think that the problem is too with the way that the business model of journalism has been evolving. 126 newspapers have shut down to where some places don't have newspapers anymore. And so they have to get their news either from CNN, Fox News, or Facebook. They have to get it from somewhere else, which is troubling on one end because CNN's never going to cover the county meeting in the middle of Kansas. And
which as Tip O'Neill pointed out, all politics is local. So if that there's no coverage of these local events, then pretty much what's going on, right?
Exactly. It just gives these small, like, city governments and state governments in these areas where newspapers have shut down almost free reign. And even the ones that have stayed open have cut down their investigative wings because you have to pay a lot for a couple stories a year. And so it's just bad business to pay 5 people for an entire year of maybe 4 stories. But at the same time, you can't get good
But
investigators.
you know, I just heard you say that you blame this on the business model. Is it only the business model, or do you think that the internet has had a role to play? I mean, print media is up against some pretty steep odds in terms of surviving period, right?
Exactly. I think that's while the business model is part of it, internet, of course, is a big part. I think it's like a perfect storm of reasons as to why all that's happening, and all the ad revenue that newspapers used to get to fund all of this is now going to Facebook, and Facebook doesn't do anything in the realm of journalism. They just post stuff that other people do, whether it's right or wrong or somewhere in between.
So that's most definitely problematic. It's a tough time. You're studying journalism. There's got to be a tough time to consider going into that field, right?
Yeah, because even on top of all that, people trust journalists less and less, and people are just getting to the point where I'll do interviews for my classes, and when I go to talk to people, just normal people, if I say, like, oh, I'm a journalist at NYU and I'm doing this, they don't want to talk to me. Like, oh, no.
So you're proud of what you want to do, and they're going, ew, stay away from me, right?
Yeah, because even for people on both sides, they've gotten to a point where they think journalists are just trying to do gotcha.
And that's not entirely without foundation, is it? I mean, the sort of investigative journalist gotcha thing?
I think that does have a foundation with especially certain outlets that just want to have shock journalism to get views, but it also gives it gives other journalists who want to actually get the story, no matter which way it goes, a bad name that they then have to work through. And yeah, overall, it's a very troubling time for journalism.
Well, let me ask you, since you are our free press guy here, is it true anymore that the free press is effective in countering human rights violations, at least as true as it once was, given that we all basically live in silos nowadays?
I think that it's not as powerful as it used to be. On human rights issues, CNN uncovered the video in Libya of slave traders, and then the Libyan government's able to respond by saying Donald Trump says CNN is fake, so why should we trust CNN here? And so I think that's very troubling, because CNN did great worked for months to be able to find out where it was, all of that, and then the Libyan government's able to use the words of the American president against the organization. And then also, people, because they live in silos, don't read certain things. Like with net neutrality, the Wall Street Journal found out through a huge investigation that hundreds of the comments that supported the FCC's decision weren't real, were posted without people's knowledge. The Russian hacking into the election, that was discovered in June of that year. And people only started talking about it in December, and they were like, oh, if only somebody would have told us. The Times told everybody, the Post told everybody, but nobody reads it anymore. And so then it creates a problem where the Times got a Pulitzer for that work. And
right.
Some people don't even believe it.
So we kind of gotten to the place where we think that nobody went to the moon, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the level of trust that we have in our news sources.
Yeah.
There seems to be substantial reason to have doubt, right? I mean, that is the most concerning part, is that, I'm sorry, I'm always trying to... Walter Cronkite, there was the perception that Walter Cronkite tried to tell it straight, without judgments. And then along came, sort of investigative journalism, and there was no longer any compunction about sort of interweaving ideological views into the reporting of the news. And I think in the long run that was a disaster because it undermined the credibility of news reporting. Would you think that's true, or am I off base here?
I think that that's true, and I think that goes back to talking about Reagan, when Reagan's FCC got rid of the fairness doctrine. And so then you had Fox News could go up and just say whatever. And it doesn't have to be true, because they're not required to do it anymore. And Rush Limbaugh can go
Could you go
on
back and explain to those of us who are ignorant what the fairness doctrine was?
The fairness doctrine was just a rule for anything that purports itself to be news had to present both sides of an issue and do it in a factual, as unbiased as possible manner. And then Reagan's FCC said that stripped that away. And then after that, you saw a huge proliferation in talk radio, especially one guy from Sacramento, Rush Limbaugh.
Is that where he originated from? I never even knew that until this instant, but go on.
Yeah, and so then he just drools into a microphone for an hour and people buy it because he doesn't have to say, yeah, but that wasn't true. Here's the facts that line up. And so it creates a problem where these places that pretend they're news give news a bad name when it's just... when they're not journalists who are posting some of this garbage, like Breitbart. That's hot garbage.
So young man,
yes.
What is your proposal? How do you fix it?
I have no idea. I would say bring back the fairness doctrine, but at the moment, considering what the FCC did yesterday, that's definitely not on their agenda. So I would say bring back the fairness doctrine, and I would say the thing is that it comes down to people's personal decisions to subscribe, because a lot of people want news, but they don't want to pay for it. And you can't have good news if you don't pay for it. Somebody's got to pay for the flight for the journalists to go and interview people in other countries, for them to go and investigate Libya and find out that there's slave trade going on there, and bring the cameras. So I think it comes down to people's personal decisions to actually subscribe and pay, and bringing back fairness doctrine.
So what we're talking about then is that remember that paying also includes having the resources to pay. So people who have the resources to take New York Times or The Economist, or which is also highly regarded, or the Post, even the Globe. Those people are now becoming only an elite group who has access to something that might arguably be called genuine news, right?
Yeah, because they aren't making as much ad revenue, so they have to charge more for subscriptions. And then it's a big cycle that's creating just a very...
So what's interesting
situation.
then is that the internet was supposed to ensure that we had access to more extensive information, but it might, in fact, be having exactly the opposite impact, right?
Absolutely.
Because there is no way to go to do research on the internet and to figure out whether a particular source you're looking at is truly credible, right?
Yeah, outside of big name organizations, yeah.
And does anybody else find this concerning, or is it just our journalist in training that's concerned by this? Oh, come on. Laura and Andrew, you're just going to sit there quietly and not say a word?
You can't see it, but we're nodding.
Okay. So you're in entire agreement with Grant that something needs to be done about this situation.
Oh, absolutely.
Indeed. So anyway, the idea was historically that democracies were more likely to comply with the terms of a human rights instrument that they had ratified because they really couldn't get away with violating it. But we're not clear that that's true anymore, and for just the reasons that we're talking about, because the free press basically is no longer subject to the same degree of or the same standard for responsibility in its reporting that it once was, and that is hurting all of us. It's hurting democracy. Anyway, so Hathaway takes the position that to the degree that states ratify treaties without the intent to comply, there must be revisions aimed at exposing and publicizing non-compliance so that there are that reputational costs of non-compliance are enhanced. So you don't get a freebie benefit just by signing and ratifying a treaty. If you don't comply, there should be a cost to your reputation for failure to comply. There should moreover be a means by which states parties can be compelled to report. The bodies examining the report should be composed of independent experts who are empowered to engage in independent investigations. There should also be a greater effort to publish findings because benefits of ratifying treaties are substantial. Universal membership may be counterproductive. Although there has been a press, certainly the High Commissioner on Human Rights has named as one of its objectives to ensure that these treaties are indeed universally ratified, but she's saying maybe not so quick. Further, those parties that cease complying should be removed. The rules of compliance, however, should not be so stringent that states just drop out of the human rights regime altogether. But is this really desirable? Although the implementation of human rights treaties is undeniably imperfect, what of Higgins' vision of international law as process? Is it possible that periodic reporting, NGO challenges to the human rights records of the reporting states, and engagement by the Human Rights Committee is superior to banishment? What do you think? Is she right? Should we banish people or states rather, because they're not complying with human rights? And I know we're over time, so just a couple of comments and we'll call it a day. What do you think?
I'm not sure to what extent that's actually an effective solution to say, well, you're part of this human rights regime, but you're not doing it, so you're out. Because then what is the draw to comply after that? So I'm not sure. I just don't understand the logic of that, but also I understand that it seems kind of hypocritical to let them stay in the convention or the regime. So kind of complicated because it should be aimed toward compelling them to start complying.
But what means of compulsion do you have? You banish them because they're bad actors. And then that's sort of a one-time thing, right? They're gone.
Yeah, exactly.
And then what do you do next?
Well, if there is some kind of incentive to actually be part of it, and then so they're looking to rejoin, then maybe you give them like a year or 2 years to start complying or to make measures that are going to improve their records and human rights, and then they can rejoin. But again, that requires that they need to actually want to be a part of it. So,
but it also requires greater monitoring, greater resources for monitoring than in fact we possess, right?
That's true.
So how do you go into East Congo and find out what's really going on? Reporters can't even do that these days. Certainly the UN doesn't have the resources, and NGOs' resources are limited as well. So how do you enhance monitoring? RX, what do you think about this? You think that, you've already said that you think that human rights instruments we should take the long view of them. So how do we ensure that we see progressive development, greater compliance over time with human rights instruments?
I think there are already regimes of the treaty to give observation of the implementation of human rights treaty of each countries and to produce this report, which is open to the public. So for those countries that hear about their reputation in the international community, they will gradually make change to comply with the international human rights instrument. But I don't think banishing these members, states and members is a good idea, because I think it will do no good for them to improve their human rights record, because one motive for them to care is their reputation, is their influence on the international community. So I think what the international community should do to improve the human rights protection is to more incorporate them into this community.
So you would take exactly the opposite position, that rather than expelling states from the international human rights community, they should be embraced and sort of directed towards, a greater adherence to human rights instruments or the provisions thereof. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think we should to communicate more with the states. Like, we should not isolate them, and I think it's a good thing that if countries can make trade-off or something like that in exchange of their improvement on human rights field.
So Andrew, going back to our previous conversation about Putin, I understand that Putin has a really poor human rights record, but what do you say to that? Is RX right? Should we engage, or should we say you're a bad man and we don't want to have anything to do with you?
I don't know. Given the choice between engagement and isolationism in regards to Putin, I'd still say constructive engagement is always the better option, because at least then you're leaving the potential open for further avenues of cooperation should circumstances change. And I think during our earlier discussion I mentioned that too, but that always has to be married though with the idea that we should stand by the values of liberal democracy and human rights, even if neither of our states fully or perfectly adhere to them.
Okay. Well, then, I guess that will be the final comment for the semester, guys. I hope very much you come back to see me for humanitarian law. I will be posting the syllabus in the next couple of weeks. While you guys are working on your tests, I'm going to be working on cleaning up my humanitarian law syllabus. And I would love to see some of you folks here. For those of you, you can communicate this to your fellow students. We're going to be posting this, obviously, for those folks that couldn't come today, and I truly regret I didn't get to say goodbye to you all. But I cannot say, I cannot underscore sufficiently, you guys have really been a great group. You've worked hard, and I've been impressed. So, I hope to see you again next year, literally, next semester. So, as before, if you have any questions in connection with the test, please send me an email. We'll do it the same way as before. We'll have a chain email. You send a question, I will respond, and everybody will have access both to the question and to the response, okay? So good luck, folks. I can't wait to see what you write.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for coming. Alrighty then. Take care.
Happy holiday.
Happy holidays to you as well. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah.